thank you very much for joining us here on our pre-budget conversation, our pre-budget dialogue as we examine the choices that the Government of India is faced with ahead of the Union budget. As is very clear, and as you just heard there from Shivani, we are dealing with a volatile and a complex geopolitical environment. There's been plenty of geo-economic fragmentation as well, and the confrontation continues on that front. In that backdrop, it is going to have to be a balancing act that the government puts together, but every budget is a balancing act, and to really help us understand the choices that the government may make and the priorities that it must focus on is someone who has plenty of experience in budget making. He spent a large part of his time in North Block putting together many budgets and of course retired as the former Finance Secretary. Mr. Garg, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us here. Before we talk about the priorities, sir, we're 48 hours away from the budget. Is it all final by now, or is there any scope or any leeway for any changes? In your experience, in the last 48 hours, have any big changes been made to the budget when you were around?
See, no changes made in the tax proposals or expenditure proposals. It's the speech on which last 48 hours are spent. That is still going on. That gets finalized only about 4 to 5 p.m. on the budget day before budget.
Okay.
That is tomorrow. So that is the only work which goes on at this time. Of course, the printing work and is what takes place at this time.
Okay, so the printing work obviously is already done, but if the finance minister wants to, sort of signal something to the market, signal something to investors, there is still scope for her to do that by way of the budget speech.
Of course, you can always include any proposal you want, big or small, in the last minute in your speech. It may not find mention in the budget documents as such, but you can make the proposals allocation or during the course of the year. So that is possible.
The scope for announcements is still possible. So let's get started, Mr. Garg. As I pointed out, we're dealing with a fairly complex environment globally. Domestically, growth projected between 6.8 to 7.2%. That is what the economic survey is going with. Nominally expected to be between 10 to 10.5%. That is what the CNBC-TV18 poll is suggesting. In this backdrop, what do you think the government's choices will be? Should we expect, should the market expect, should investors expect an even higher allocation on capex? What would you be penciling in?
See, the world is going through a massive transition. I would not call it complexity as such. It is a very big transformation going around. Chinese economy has grown. Europeans are also coming back. Americans are behaving in a very different world. So these three blocks now going up. And the old world order, the UN and other trade agreements, etc., are going down. It's a new world which is emerging. So you are faced with a situation that in this new emerging world, how do you deal with it? How do you shape up your policies and programs? And in that context, capital expenditure or the spending for economic growth kind of thing is one of the very important function of the finance minister. If you do the hard budget sort of crunching, number crunching, of the about 51 lakh crores of the budget for the current year, roughly about 11 crores is spent on the economic growth, including
11 lakh crores.
11 lakh crores. Yes. That is not capital expenditure alone. There is a lot of revenue expenditure, which also PLI, by the way, is a revenue expenditure. So taking PLI, the revenue expenditures as well as capital expenditure infrastructure, that adds to about 11 lakh crores. That expenditure would be one where the finance minister would be looking very closely, that what do you do for the next year? There is one major constraint in my judgment, since revenues are not growing well. So the finance minister would be hard pressed to sort of decide how much to increase the overall size of the budget. In my judgment, that may not be possible for her to raise it beyond 5 to 6%.
Okay.
So if you raise the total budget expenditure by 5 to 6%, and you have certain expenditures to take care in any case, like the interest, which grows at much more higher rate, and the Finance Commission recommendations would also be coming, which will require greater allocations for the state transfers, etc. In that situation, can you increase the capital expenditure as well as the other economic growth expenditure by a very large margin? I suspect that space is not there. So I would see that this, in my judgment, it will either be more or less at this level, or maybe couple of percentage higher than that.
Okay, so single digit increase is what you're anticipating as far
lower single digit.
Lower single digit increase is what you're anticipating as far as capex allocations are concerned. Mr. Garg, you know, let's talk about whether the government should or has the space at this point in time to do anything as far as, for instance, the long-term capital gains tax is concerned. I'll ask you this in the context of the fact that you were in North Block in 2018 when your colleague in the Revenue Department, Hasmukh Adhia, brought in the long-term capital gains tax. A, do you believe that a reversal, a rollback is warranted given the fact that India wants to attract flows? And B, do you believe the government will take that step?
So you see, in last year, the government did take two big tax adventurous steps, if I may call it. The income tax limit was raised to 12 lakhs for everyone, which in fact took away lots of taxpayers from actually paying taxes. The numbers don't come, but in my judgment, there are not more than 2 crore actually tax-paying people now. Then you saw the GST cut being announced, very major for pleasing the middle class, which is essentially also earns by way of the capital gains, etc. So if you look at from the point of view of that this is a constituency which the government thinks politically is required to be sort of assuaged or pleased, so to say, the government may embark on this kind of adventure again. But if you look at actual results of it, these two cuts did not lead to much of the consumption expenditure or consumption expansion in the economy. And you also look at the fact that the taxation of wages or salaries is much higher at 30% plus, and the capital gains in a way are taxed at 12.5%.
Yeah.
So an easier money in a way is taxed at lower rate, and the harder earned money is taxed at a higher rate.
Yes.
There is no space, or even in principle or otherwise, and the government's tax revenue growth being very small this year. So on merit, there doesn't appear to be a case or a possibility, but if you are targeting politically or otherwise, you may have. But even from that point of view, in my judgment, the cycle of elections this year are not the ones where the government would like to sort of take a risk of reducing the tax, because the possibility of winning those elections on the strength of these kind of tax cut is much less than what it was last year before Delhi election this was brought in. So my sense is no likelihood
No likelihood of a rollback as far as the LTCG is concerned, or even a cut at this point in time. Let's then talk about what the economic survey has laid out, and in the context of that, I would like to understand what you believe the budget may choose to prioritize. I think the underlying message of the survey was that the Indian state needs to become much more entrepreneurial and the Indian corporate needs to become much more competitive. In that backdrop then, export competitiveness, measures for enhancing exports, any new schemes that you believe that the government may bring in to drive and further accelerate exports?
See, the state's principal job is to deliver good public goods and services well. The state is not a business entity. It doesn't need to be entrepreneurial in the sense of business person, right? So that advice...
It needs to be entrepreneurial in the sense that it nurtures and allows businesses to be much more entrepreneurial.
So it should be policy entrepreneurial. It should come up with, the government must come up with the right kind of policies, right kind of economic structure, right kind of macroeconomic management, currency management. And that is where the government can be entrepreneurial in the business sense. Not, and But if you look at, so we run very large number of public sectors. Some of them are efficient, but many of them are not efficient. That is where the government acts as a businessman. So you don't need to be entrepreneurial in that sense. You divest better. That would be entrepreneurial. There is an advice in the economic survey to consider this.
Yes.
For last 5 years, if you look at, virtually the disinvestment, the privatization of business has been shut.
Yeah.
So that is lack of entrepreneurship in the policy sense also in my mind. So if the government can become entrepreneurial, one thing it can do is to sort of scale up the disinvestment and the privatization program. The second one, which I think has been displayed in the deal which we have done with EU, is that expose the businesses and industry to the competition, the international competition. The way the government has rightly reduced the duties on automobiles and many other things in the EU and earlier in the UK FTA, I think that's a right way to expose the industry to the competition and to show the government's entrepreneurial face. It's not good to have more and more of PLIs and those kind of things, or provide incentives or interest subsidies, etc. That's not entrepreneurial. That's actually making the industry and the businesses overprotected and weak. So if the government can actually become entrepreneurial in this sense, I think it will do a great service to the nation.
And I think there was a hint there, and there was a signal from the economic advisor saying that protection must not be in perpetuity, also suggesting that incentives should be linked to higher productivity and should be conditional on what companies can achieve in terms of exports and so on and so forth. Do you believe that that perhaps is going to be the way that shapes policy?
For the government, it's very difficult to do this fine-tuned kind of analysis that when are you getting, your time is enough, protection is over, good enough, now move. It's very difficult. There used to be one very economic argument for the government, that was the infant industry argument. That there is always a stage whenever there is an evolution internationally and globally, certain new industries come up, they need to be given some handholding in the form of R&D support, in the form of infrastructure support, in the form of some procurement orders and things like that. So that is there today. There are many industries, for example, let us say energy transition, solar, or the digital transition, or the electric vehicles and many other kind of things. So these are the industries which in the classical sense of an infant industry argument requires government support. But for the mature old economy industry like steel, aluminium, or MSMEs or whatever, they don't require any support. The time has been long gone for those subsidies and supports to be withdrawn. Do it fast, immediately, rather than perpetuating them any longer.
So the sun must set on some of these existing subsidies. That's the message that you're sending out, and offer protection to infant industries or sunrise sectors. And we've seen that happen even as far as the India-EU FTA is concerned, where EVs have been left out of the tariff reduction plan, at least for the next 5 years. Mr. Garg, defense, and I think there is unequivocal consensus on it. This is the first budget post-Operation Sindoor. We're likely to see a higher allocation. In fact, we've got our budget editor, the former defense secretary here with us, Girdhar Armane, and he'll of course also join us to talk about that. But defense spending, you believe that we're likely to see a significantly higher number there?
So there are two broad defense expenditure heads. One is the revenue head, where you take for salaries and pensions and things like that. And the other one is the capital outlays, where you provide the capital outlays for sort of raising the capacity and the war readiness of the defense sector. So I think you were talking about this capex kind of thing. So which serves two purposes. Number one, it serves the purpose of keeping the country's readiness for taking on any war, and if there is a bad environment kind of thing, you need more of it. And second, it also has an economic dimension that if you produce many of those things domestically, it gives a boost to the domestic industry as well.
Yeah.
So considering...
And also links back to the pivot that the Chief Economic Advisor is speaking of, strategic indispensability. Perhaps this pivot could be linked to that as well.
Quite right. If you use both the words, strategic
and indispensability,
so then it becomes very much relatable to defense.
Yeah.
Right. So it looks very, I think, very easy to say that there has to be and there would be an increase in the defense outlay. You can say it, but there is a constraint, the overall constraint. So how much the government will have the legal space to allocate higher amounts for the defense, whether it's 10% higher or 15% higher. But I don't see any possibility of it being beyond 10 to 15%.
10 to 15%. That brings me then to the question, Mr. Garg, because what I hear from you is you believe that the government has limited fiscal room to maneuver, given the fact that it stated its objective of maintaining this fiscal glide path. In that scenario, do you then anticipate expenditure compression?
See, there are, the government's expenditure, unfortunately, is so tightly done that you have very little space to reduce, except in the situation where you take a very large strategic view. And let me illustrate. For example, capital expenditure. We spent about 5 lakh crores over 3 big items: railways, roads, and the metros, right? If you do a very careful study of the effectiveness, productivity, and its contribution to economic growth, you would find that there is very little economic growth impact of these kind of expenditures, right? Look at railways. Get hard facts right. The National Economic Statistics bring this out. What is the contribution to GVA of this expenditure? What is the kind of increase in passenger traffic which has been brought about in the last 6 years? You would find that these expenditures are perhaps not that effective at all. Now you have alternate. I talked about energy transition. You have the digital transitions, data centers, many other things. Energy transition requires enormous amount of expenditure.
As do data centers.
So if we look at that strategically, that this 20th century industrial economy kind of expenditures on railways and roads and metros or BSNLs, which is a sinking well. So instead of those expenditures, you reduce them, and part of that, even half of that, if you transition towards the new strategic sectors, then you may have space to do the right kind of thing. But if you don't want to touch them, there is no space for doing anything better and good.
You know, and that brings me then to the question about the Finance Commission, because what people don't realize is that we've also got the Finance Commission's report, which will be tabled along with the budget. So there's 2 big documents to go over on Sunday, which is the 1st of February. The impact of the Finance Commission, Mr. Garg, do you believe that the Finance Commission is likely to change that 41% devolution number, which is what the center guarantees to states?
See, the Finance Commission has to balance what is the state's needs as well as what is the center's regal space, that how much central taxes can go. I think over the year this formula of 42% including J&K and 41% excluding J&K, I think this has come to a level where there is a fair balance, and it has got a political acceptability in the country as well. States keep on demanding 50%. But 42%, I think, is a level which is acceptable to most of the states easily. If the Finance Commission has recommended a reduction in that would be political hierarchy to my mind. So I don't think Finance Commission would have recommended it. But even if the Finance Commission has recommended it, I don't think government will accept it. So that I take it as given. There is one big head which the finance commissions have been sort of recommending large amounts of money. We have this called the revenue gap grants kind of thing. Because finance commission, when it does the calculations that the state's required or legitimate expenditure is this much, and post devolution, if the availability of resources is this much, and there is a gap, that gap is sought to be filled up by these revenue grants. Last time, if I remember, I think it's 2.5 lakh crores or something was recommended. This is pernicious. I don't believe that these grants are right.
Okay.
Because these grants make what we were talking about, the weaker industry, it makes the weaker states over-dependent upon the center. So if you can do away with those grants, though again it's very difficult for the government to do it, but if those grants can be done away with, then perhaps there might be some sort of saving. By the way, by the time you come to the last year of the previous finance commission recommendation, these grants are very small. Right. So I don't think there would be a big effect on the whole, even if the finance commission has recommended no revenue gap grants. So I don't think the government can look at any sort of fiscal space because of the finance commission recommendations. All it can hope is that it does not put additional burden on the government.
So you anticipate a status quo, even if the finance commission doesn't recommend it, you believe the government will go in for the same number as far as the devolution is concerned. Let me ask you two quick questions before I let you go, sir, because it's not just the finance commission. For those of you who may not know, we are moving to a new series. The base year revision is also happening, which will of course impact the way that we calculate CPI and so on and so forth. And here's what Mosby is saying, Mr. Garg. So let me put that to you. The new CPI series to have a lower weight for food to have a weight of 34.77% in the new CPI series, beverages to have a weight of 1.77%, and the combined weight of food and beverages now at 36.54% versus almost 46% in the previous series. Will this reduce the food volatility, the food inflation shock, the food inflation volatility that we've otherwise seen?
Of course, I think this is an overweight which our CPI has it. So our indices for measuring the inflation need to be reformed. This is one necessary reform. The other one is this producers price index, which we have the wholesale price index, which does not even have the services there. So we have a very awkward system of the wholesale or the producers price indices, which does not even measure the inflation in more than 50% of the economy. So the whole thing needs to be improved. How much it will have the volatility effect is difficult to judge, because food of course is very volatile, which you have seen in the last year. But I think the other index which need to move is to move this the base year for the GDP from 2011-12 to somewhere 22-23. That's more necessary, because one of the necessary implications of that is that what we have, the difference between the real and the nominal GDP will go away. Because as you come closer in the base, the difference goes away. And that is where, to my mind, one of the very key, we flaunt it, that we are the largest growing economy in the world with 7% odd growth for the current year. But if you look at the nominal, which in the international sense is better measured in the dollar GDP growth. So we have nominal growth of 8% for the current year, and we have 6.5% depreciation of rupee against the dollar. So our dollar growth internationally is only 1.5%. So which is one of the lowest in the world. So for the rest of the world, what matters is not what your real GDP growth is, but what is the dollar GDP growth of the country in the comparative sense. That is one of the lowest.
That's a whole other debate and discussion, Mr. Garg. But if you were in North Block today, with the rupee being at 92, how much do you think that is going to weigh on the finance minister's mind as she puts out budget 2026?
See, there is one positive spin-off of the rupee depreciation, because
for exporters.
No, for the government revenue. So what happens is that the RBI surplus is essentially dependent upon how much rupee depreciates against dollar, and what is the international dollar interest rates. And since both of them are favoring in a way,
Yeah.
you can expect higher dividend of 50,000 to 75,000 crores more next year. So that, for the finance minister, in a way, is a beneficial thing to happen. But oil, for example, is where you affect adversely your subsidies on petroleums and gas and fertilizers. That, fortunately for us, in a way, the international oil prices have been subdued.
Right.
So that's not a problem. So on rupee depreciation, I think finance minister can feel a little relaxed.
A little relaxed, even though the headlines are focusing on the sharp and swift decline that we have seen, but expect a significantly higher dividend from the RBI. So perhaps another RBI bazooka by way of a dividend is what we should expect on account of the rupee depreciation. Mr. Garg, thank you so much for kicking things off here on the Budget Vision 2026 as we look forward to the next 48 hours and wait for Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman to present her record-breaking 9th budget. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for the former Finance Secretary, Subhash Chandra Garg.